In the northeastern part of Kamchatka, where ridges slowly scattered into valleys and fog crept in from the Pacific Ocean, stretched one of the last wild frontiers, a protected area known as the Quiet Reserve. There were no towns, no asphalt, no signage, just the stillness of cedar shrubbery, the roar of waterfalls, and the tracks of beasts on wet pebbles. Two brown bears, a male and a female, had traveled a long way to these parts. Their former homeland, which lay south along the coast, had been depleted. The salmon came up less and less each season. The streams grew shallow, and dangerous men in fishing vests and with bulky things that smelled of metal and blood roamed the woods more and more often. The bears did not understand what was happening, but they felt that their place of residence no longer belonged to them. And one day, in late August, in the cold rain, they left. He was older, sturdy, covered with light scars on his shoulder and behind his ear, the memory of fights with other males. She was smaller, with a sensitive gait and a black streak from eye to cheek, as if drawn in charcoal. Their path took them through forests, volcanic slopes, pumice-strewn banks, and cold river crossings. Sometimes they found berries, sometimes they caught grayling, but most of the way they starved. At night, the bear would lie down at the foot of a rock or in the thick of a bush, and the exhausted mother bear would fall asleep, cuddled against him. Autumn was already taking its toll, and in the morning their breath merged with the vapor of the earth. But something drew them forward, instinct or memory, or perhaps the smell of distant water and the promise of spawning grounds, which they caught not far from Cape Twisted. On the 5th day of their journey, they came to the northern boundary of the Pacific Reserve, an area walled off from the world by a system of hidden cameras, aerial drones, and observer groups. This was a place where specialists, not tourists, worked. No wild animals were fed here, no guided tours. It was guarded. That very morning, camera operator Michelle Taylor noticed a strange picture on the screen. Two bear-like figures, barely recognizable in the pre-dawn glow, moving down Dry Creek. They weren't aggressive. They weren't rummaging through trash. There wasn't any trash. They were searching. They were looking for a place to stay. Michelle radioed her colleague, Chief Inspector Vincent Kane. He had been working in the area for over 10 years and knew the bear trails by heart. When he saw the images from the cameras, he knew immediately that these were not local animals. Out-of-towners, he said, squinting. The male is big, the female ... He stopped, looking at her gait. She's not wounded, but she looks heavy. Could be pregnant. Do you think we should be worried? Michelle asked. No, not yet. Let them get used to it. We'll keep an eye on them. The main thing, not to interfere. Thus began their silent chronicle. Two observers and two beasts, neither suspecting how their fates would intertwine. For a week, the bears surveyed the area. They stayed away from the stations, although they repeatedly passed close to the hidden camera traps. Their behavior did not resemble wild behavior. A bear stopped, sniffed rocks, and noticing a camera flare, only blinked, not being frightened. The female bear ate little, lay by the water more, and one day Michelle noticed how she struggled to rise to her feet after a long rest. She's having trouble moving. It looks like labor is close. Then we don't have much time, Vincent said. If it gets difficult, there's no way she'll survive. Neither she nor the cub. The reserve, though it had the means, did not intervene unless absolutely necessary. Bears were not pets here, but part of the free world. But Michelle couldn't forget the footage. The way the male got between the female bear and a passing drone. The way she bowed her head to the ground as if unable to hold it. On the 12th day, the wind from the ocean picked up and the temperature plummeted. That night, Michelle, on duty alone, saw the bear lying down near an old lava den at the foot of Little Ridge. The male was anxiously walking in circles. She turned on the thermal imager and froze. The female's body was twitching in rhythmic contractions. She's giving birth, Michelle whispered, pressing her palm to her lips. She called Vincent. He arrived 40 minutes later. Together they watched as the bear's twisted figure writhing in the shadow of the cliffs. The wind rumbled around them, wet snow falling from the clouds. The male growled toward the headlights but did not approach. He paced nearby, wheezing and stopping as if he could hear her moaning. "It won't last," Vincent said. "If we don't help, we'll lose them both." They decided to take their chances. The wind picked up the scent, and under its cover they approached. Michelle carried the sedative spray and the syringe of oxytocin, and Vincent the self-defense equipment. The male spotted them 30 meters away. He rose on his hind legs, growled menacingly, but did not move. He seemed to realize that what mattered now was not strength, but chance. The female moaned. Her eyes were cloudy, her breathing intermittent. Michelle approached, slowly, one step at a time down the slope. She knelt down 2 meters away, arm outstretched with a syringe. Her lips whispered something meaningless, but her voice was soft, non-threatening. The female didn't strike. She only blinked, and that was enough. The injection went quickly. They retreated, hiding behind a ledge. An hour and a half of fighting went on. The wind howled in the gorge. The male sat with his muzzle pressed against the rock, and then there was a barely audible squeak. And then it went quiet. The squeak became more distinct, faint but insistent. The bear lifted her head, breathing hard, and pulled the tiny lump covered with steam toward her. It trembled, it seemed, not from the cold, but from the very fact of birth. The male approached slowly, without growling. He lowered his muzzle and licked the newborn bear cub, carefully, almost tenderly. The cub let out a short cry in response, and in that sound was all the fullness of life. From her hiding place, Michelle watched as the mother sucked in her cub's first scent, then nuzzled her nose into its wet fur. Vincent stood silently beside her, his eyes moist, but his face like stone. He had witnessed many things, but this was the first time he had seen such a birth. "Let's call him Hatun," Michelle whispered. "In honor of the nearby rock, let him be strong." "Or after you," Vincent grinned. Hatun means mistress in one of the languages. It fits. That night they recorded everything in the observation log. The bear had calved but survived. The labor was under control. The intervention was minimal. The cub emerged alive, full term, with normal signs of reflexes. The male exhibited protective behavior. No threats were recorded. Both were advised not to approach for the next 24 hours. The next day, the reserve seemed to exhale. Alarm protocols were turned off at the perimeter stations, and instead of reports, only the weather sounded on the air, as on those rare days when nothing in the wilderness requires urgent intervention. The bear family remained at the rock, temporarily but surely. The female bear, now named Yuna, barely stood up. Baby bear Hatun sucked milk, slept, squeaked, sucked again. The male Vartan, as he was called according to Vincent's notes, guarded the neighborhood. He went up the slope, sniffed the air, and often returned with salmon or roots that he brought and left not far from the den. Vartan was not a typical male. Most bears left after mating, disappearing into the forest. He stayed. He didn't just protect, he lived nearby, slept at the entrance to the den, chased away foxes with his roar, and even once chased away a flock of crows, circling the stream. It gave Michelle a strange, inexplicable thrill, as if there was more than instinct behind the animal. 2 months passed. Hatun began to take his first steps, shakily, with falls, but with a great thirst for movement. Yuna would nudge him with her muzzle or turn him over with her paw. Sometimes she let him climb on himself as if he were a tree. Vartan watched from a distance, but if the cub crawled too far, he growled softly and let it crawl back. At that time, the reserve began its fall raids, long-distance detours, trap checks, aerial drone surveys. There seemed to be no threats, but Vincent insisted that the patrols be stepped up. 3 stretching lines with loops, illegal traps, had been found outside the reserve boundary. Michelle had heard about it at the morning meeting. Vincent spoke dryly, without emotion. "These are not just poachers. These are systemic groups. They set traps at the intersections of bear trails. Do you think they'll reach us? I don't think so. But if they hear about Vartan and Yuna, they will. They're worth their weight in gold." That same day, Michelle traveled to Snowy Ridge, where the last observation point recorded the pair's activity. The helicopter took her to the temporary base. There, on the slope, she saw them again. Hatun was no longer just crawling. He was running. His movements were clumsy, but full of energy. He caught falling leaves, stood on his hind legs, growled at nothing. Vartan watched patiently, and Yuna rested, listening to his son's every move. They spent the day by the creek. When the snow began to fall, the bear family retreated deep into the forest. Michelle took off her gloves and wrote in her notebook, "Hatun is almost 4 months old, stable growth. Yuna, recovered. Vartan, still around. More than a guard, almost a father." But in the evening there was an alarming report. A dead bear was found 30 kilometers south of the reserve. Traces of blood led to the river. The trap was triggered on the front paw. The animal tried to free itself, but died of blood loss. Age, about 5 years. Male. Michelle and Vincent left immediately. Vincent remained silent as they drove, his fingers clenched on the steering wheel. Michelle only asked once, "Not Vartan?" That one was smaller, different, but it was a sign. When they returned, the sanctuary was already tense. Cameras captured 2 men in winter uniforms circling the southern perimeter. Coherent movements, faces covered. On the thermal imager screen, Michelle saw that Vartan was nervous. He stood up often, sniffing the air. Yuna and Hatun were hiding closer to the slope, in an old stone hollow where the camera signals barely reached. "They feel threatened," Michelle said. "So do we," Vincent replied and stepped out to assemble an intercept team. As winter came, the forest became tougher, sharper. Snow covered the trails, and only the tracks, clear, deep, gave away that someone was still here. Bears usually burrowed by the beginning of December, but Yuna and Vartan were slow. Probably because of Hatun. He was still too weak to cope with the first frost without the full protection of his parents. They were choosing a place. Vartan was feeling extremely tired. He had lost weight, his fur was dull, but his eyes remained clear, intense. He didn't trust the odors coming from the south, and he was right. On the 3rd day after fixing the uninvited guests, a high-resolution camera, installed at the old cordon, transmitted footage. 2 men in camouflage, moving along the bed of the river Death. They were looking for something, checking with the navigator. Their route coincided with Vartan's trail. Michelle saw the footage on the screen in the office, then again in slow motion. One of the men was carrying a box covered in fur. "They have bait," Vincent said quietly. "They might try to lure us out. We can't just watch. We won't." That same night, Vincent flew out with a 3-man team, each with a snowmobile, a thermal imager, and self-defense gear. Reserve employees weren't allowed to engage in conflict unless there was a threat to life, but this time the threat was different. The loss of the trust they'd spent years building between man and wild land. Yuna, meanwhile, led Hatun to an old ravine. There, under a fallen pine tree, was a natural cavity convenient for wintering. Vartan followed them, always stopping, looking around, smelling. He sensed danger, not specific, but like an electric current in the air. When Yuna climbed inside and called to Hatun with a short sound, he turned around. Only then, for the first time in a long time, did he growl loudly. That growl was heard by the humans as well. Michelle at headquarters, Vincent in the woods, and also the 2 that had tried to go unnoticed. That's when they tried. They threw a bundle of fish and a hide onto the snow, injecting the scent of a female. The bait would work on any hungry beast. But Vartan didn't go. He circled around, realized the scent was foreign. It wasn't Yuna. It was a trick. He didn't attack. But he did something else. He stood up to his full height and roared so loud that the snow fell from the pines. Vincent heard it. The poachers heard it too. It was calculated. The roar was a signal for action. Those men were apprehended. Their call signs were local, but their IDs were fake. They didn't answer any questions, but in their bag they found a map, a marked route to the den to which Vartan had led his family. Michelle didn't sleep that night. She watched everything from the first footprints on the creek to the shot of Vartan standing in front of the lens and freezing as if challenged. When she climbed the pass in the morning to make sure the family was all right one last time, the camera at the entrance to the ravine showed her what she wanted, the three together. Hatun at her mother's side. Vartan is beside her, all alive. It was all wrapped up. 2 days later, the bears went into the den. The thermal imaging camera recorded how Yuna's body settled down. Then Hatun nestled under her breast, and Vartan at her side, but so that he could see the entrance, and the last flash of the camera before silence fell. Vartan's eyes looking straight into the lens. No fear, no anger, as if he understood something. In the spring, they were expected. Everyone knew they would come out. And they did, in mid-April, when the snow had thawed on the slopes and the first streams had broken through the rock. Hatun was already larger, his coat thicker, his movements more confident. Yuna had grown well again, and Vartan turned gray. A little. But he was still as strong, as restrained as ever. When Michelle saw them again, in the distance, from the helicopter, she suddenly realized that the story she had witnessed was not about intervention, not about rescue. It was about the line. About the thin line between trust and rejection, where wild hearts can recognize that a person can do more than destroy. Later, in a summer report, she will write, "Let no one know where the den is. Let the animals just be left alone. Hatun has grown up. Yuna has grown wise. Vartan is still guarding. They're alive, and that's what matters. We do not tame. We are only there for a time. And if there is even one chance to preserve the fragile peace created by nature, we must take it."